Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Pegasus Files. It's Andrew McGuigan here from Acart Communications. I'm super excited to have another great guest on the show. I've got Teresa Foreman, who is a globally renowned consultant with THF consultancy firm, and she is a extraordinaire as it pertains to brand strategy and go-to-market. Welcome to the show, Teresa.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I guess before we get into, obviously, the show, we talk a lot about COVID-19, the pandemic. There's some marketing, branding, entrepreneurship, and philanthropy elements for sure. But before we dive into that, I'd love to get just a bit of an overview of your background. Where you born and raised? How did you find your way into strategy? I'd love to just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Born and raised in Montreal. Spent most of my life there. So I speak English, speak French. Probably spent more than half my life there. Moved to Ottawa about 20 years ago. Studied to be a teacher, and then decided not to be a teacher. Went into business after my first summer job, and I just fell in love with that. And that's kind of how I got here.
That's awesome. And so I guess, where did your passion start to develop for strategy?
That's a great question. Like I said, I was originally going to be a teacher. Took a summer job at a global telco in Montreal, Acart Communications. And while I was there, I just fell in love with business, and more specifically, I fell in love with strategy. Why? I've always been very curious. I think curiosity is one of my core values, one of my core traits. I love learning. I love getting to the bottom of things, figuring them out. And so the rest, I was very fortunate to have that opportunity when I was working at that global telco to be able to, dive into some pretty interesting business problems and be at the table in terms of trying to figure them out, even as a summer intern. So I was very grateful that I had that opportunity. And the rest, as they say, is history. It sort of changed the trajectory of my career.
Mm-hmm. So maybe can you give us a little bit of a rundown of your career and what's your path or your roadmap sort of looked like, and talk about maybe some of the different areas and key areas that you've touched?
Yeah, sure. So my path in some ways has been very traditional in terms of trajectory, and in other ways not so traditional. Like I said, I didn't initially go to school to become a strategist per se, although that sort of sorted itself out. But my first job was at, as I said, the PR department of a global telco. But then I really grew up after I left that job. I really grew up in the consumer goods sector in a food and beverage company, where I did product marketing and management, up to category management, up to leading the team, and really grew up there and honed my skills really on strategy, go-to-market, branding, etc. So that's spent a good chunk of change there in Montreal. And then I moved over to a global B2C, B2B software company and led the brand and marketing strategic team there. And that was, very interesting. It was really the deeper toe in the water around B2B, deeper toe in the water around a global company, global presence, what that means let alone from the time zone perspectives, what that means culturally, and having to look at how do you go to market differently in those markets and whatnot. So that was really great. From there, I moved to a global engineering professional services firm, believe it or not, which was, like I said, I like to sort of crack things apart and see how they work. So that was really fascinating. Also, again, led the strategic brand and marketing team for there. But there I was also very specifically brought in to build not only a marketing department and a marketing discipline in a fairly technical environment, but also to build up a product development and marketing machine to be able to do repeatable revenue. And then I spent over a decade on agency side, so building out a strategic practice within an agency, which included brand strategy, business strategy, user experience strategy, demand gen strategy, et cetera. And ultimately, my role there was building out that department, building out a global services, strategic services practice for B2B, B2C, nonprofit, and in charge of sort of the revenue streams and the profitability. And yeah, so that and now I'm consulting with other global brands to do those same things. So I feel, in a nutshell, I feel that it's been a pretty even split between client side and agency side work, but always grounded in, how are the brand and business strategy links, and how do we take that
Right.
to market? Yeah.
Right. So I
So that,
a question. Yeah, a question I have for you obviously is, like, strategy is obviously, is something that for many years has been viewed as, esoteric and elusive, and people don't really, it's that thing they can't really put their fingers on or really quite understand. Like, when do you, like, but now there's a big impetus on it. Like, it's very prevalent now in a lot of businesses. We've got strategy that's leading decision making, and it's at the forefront of what businesses are doing. Where have you seen in your career the transition of that? And maybe you can speak to agency side or maybe on client side, but where have you seen that transition start to occur?
I think on client side, in my experience, it was always important, provided it was fast and quick, and frankly, the sales team was on board and the CFO was on board.
Mhm.
But there's always been some degree of respect for strategy on client side in my experience. Maybe not always marketing per se, but definitely for strategy. I think it's become even more, more and more on client side. Even when I was on agency side, I was seeing this with our clients. They're still, to a degree, marketers are still having to justify their existence internally before they can even look at their success externally. And I think that's more true on client side than it is agency side. But now that marketing has become, with a marketing tech stack, much more data driven, and you can actually put data and like rational and logical decision making behind some of the decisions that used to be maybe a little more gut or instinct or traditional. It's definitely I'd probably say the last 5 years on client side become really a very respected practice. On agency side, I would say in probably maybe only the last few years, frankly, agencies have been very either creatively driven or developmentally driven, if it's like a digital production shop. And so strategy has always been, or traditionally within an agency, sort of that more back of the house, do the consumer research, what's the core insight, create a brief, and then creative teams or whatnot would be off and running. And what I've seen and what I experienced in my agency existence, and what I had to drive as the head of that department, was what is that contribution that strategy could make, not even just to creative, which is important but very narrow, but also to our client's business. So ultimately, where in our case anyways, where strategy became really important was we were able to build trusted advisor relationships with our C-suite clients, which is very, very different than what strategy was doing even when I started, in there just a decade or so ago. And so the value and the value of strategy has risen tremendously. It's something that clients are over and over happy to pay a premium for, because they view it as less commodity, right? And some of those other items that agencies are producing, creative development, whatnot, whether you agree with it or not, there is a market perception that it is becoming commoditized. And what isn't really becoming commoditized is that thinking, right? That, small s strategic thinking across the whole agency, and large s strategic thinking from the strategy department. So that's, like, in earnest, I've seen more respect, that the role of strategy has gone up the value chain, and probably really quite significantly in the last few years.
Yeah, you actually, that's that was actually one of my questions, is where do you see the main value of this function being within a business? Like when you look at it, I guess on the client side, on the where do you see the main value driver being for strategy within a business?
I think that, strategy, I often get asked, well, strategy, what is that? Right? It's just
Yeah.
it's so ethereal. I'm not really sure what that means. And so, I truly believe strategy to a large degree is just common sense. It's taking a look at all the data points that are available to you and sort of narrowing it down and finding a path. And I often then I hear back, oh, so strategy, you're the one who tells people what to do, or not you, but your role is the one who tells people what to do. And I say quite the opposite. So I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Porter, but he's a very very well known, very renowned business strategist, and he's a professor at the Harvard School of Business. And I love one of his quotes is, strategy is actually deciding what not to do. It's not necessarily what to do. It's like, yeah, you can do this, but here's all the reasons you shouldn't do these other things. And I think to answer your question, that's where the value is, because when you look out on the horizon, there's just, if you liken it to sort of a road, there's so many roads you can take. So strategy is defining, like, what is that roadmap? When you go out on a trip, you don't just, like, well, maybe you do, but if you just head out in any direction and hope for the best, you're probably going to get lost, right? So you do your planning, you figure out the road, you figure out, like, let's not go this way, let's not go that way, and effectively, like, that's what I mean. It's sort of common sense. It's strategy. It's really important in creative work, on agency side, and frankly, even with client side, internal creative teams. In order for them to do their best work, they really need some guidelines, right? Like, they sort of get paralyzed when you say, do whatever you want. Like, I'm sure it'll be great. It'll be beautiful. You really have to give them some guidelines, a singular insight, a direction, and then let them fly. And that's where I've seen sort of when you're taking that work to market, that it's the most successful. Like, what is that one thing you're trying to influence in those consumers whose behavior you're trying to change? And frankly, it's expensive to get it wrong, right? And one of the things I like to tell clients who don't usually want to, we don't have the time, we don't have the money to invest in strategy, let's just get to the doing, right? And it's like, no, like, in my experience, companies never have the time or budget to do it right the first time, but they certainly find it to do it right the second time when the first doesn't go well. Right. So, like,
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think you do hear about, on mass media, hear about the times where things go wrong. A brand looks at a brand extension, getting into a different market. They haven't done their homework. The market looks hot, and all of a sudden they're collapsing and dissolving themselves of that market. I think Dell was a good example of that with the MP3 player when they wanted to compete with Apple. I think that was just a really interesting, sort of example of that. So I think let's chat about COVID-19, because, I mean, there's many businesses that are being shaken up right now, and they're having to figure out how they're going to survive. And I think there's really maybe two states. There's the brands that think, there's the brands that are going to be able to go back to operationally acting and doing what they were doing post-pandemic, that the way they were doing things pre-pandemic, and then there's the brands that have realized that they can't go back to the way they were doing things before. So where are you seeing, what are your general thoughts here about, brands looking at pivots, looking at brand extensions, changing who they are? What are your general thoughts there? What do you see?
I see a lot of great things, and I see a lot of tone deaf things, for lack of a better word. But I think, to your point, whether it's COVID or whether it was 9/11 or whether it was anything, and it's crisis, and in times of crisis, and we're in a crisis for sure right now, that crisis management plan, not everybody has one. Actually, in my experience, most companies don't. And so people are like, we don't have a crisis plan, what are we going to do? Well, it's just really important to fall back on your brand. Like, what do you stand for, right? And you need to continue to stand for that. So I think in times of crisis, the business strategy, the brand strategy, how you're going to market is so important. And so what I'm seeing, which is really concerning to me in some regards, is so many of the people, even in my network, like 1 degree from me, who are leaders in small to medium-sized enterprise level marketing departments, are having their budgets slashed, frozen, redirected, and sometimes the redirection makes sense, and sometimes it's just leadership that's fearful to spend money, right? And sort of that brand management comes to a screeching halt. And personally, I think that's a big mistake. I think in times of crisis, there's not only an opportunity, not to sound opportunistic, but I think there's an obligation for a brand to be seen and heard. You know, people, as we know, the research shows, consumers behind them more and more want to be aligned with companies that share their values. And it's not
Yes.
always about the dollar, right? It's like, what are your values? What are you standing for? Et cetera. And I see some companies doing that well, and I'll speak to those in a second. And like I said, I see others that are just like, well, everything's on hold until we know what's going on. I don't, you know, like if people want to hear and from the brands they admire or that they're doing business with or that they buy as consumers, they want reassurance. They want a sense of comfort. They want to feel that it's business as usual, even when it's not. And not seeing a lot of that, but I am seeing in other places. You look at some, you know, some brands are, like I said, tone deaf, and I won't mention them here, but there's some brands that I'm on the mailing list for that are still emailing me about, you know, buy these pair of boots, or I have a bit of a boot thing, but whatever, you know, buy this, you know, bathroom vanity, buy this
Yeah.
kitchen, you know, stove. And like, it's like, do you even realize what's going on in the world right now? Completely tone deaf. And then you see other brands that are being very transparent about, okay, look, you know, we're in crisis and here's what we're going to do for you. And they're showing leadership where necessary. And they're showing, I'm a big fan of servant leadership, and they're showing servant leadership where necessary. And others, which I love, are sort of, I mean, you know, the cynics would say, well, they're still making a buck. And yes, they are. But companies like H&M and Zara, for example, and many other companies are like, who's buying clothes right now? Not as many people as who need PPE or, you know, medical masks, the mask covers, you know, everything workers need. And so here are clothing manufacturers who aren't pumping out fast fashion for the next spring line right now. They're pivoting. They're making money, but they're pivoting to create much needed PPE materials within the United States and Europe. You know, so I think COVID is really like, you know, even if
Yeah.
you bring it down to the individual level, you know, that expression, you really find out what people are made of in times of crisis. Well, I think the same can be said of brands.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Like, there's been a lot of distilleries, for example, across Canada that are now making a hand sanitizer, and there's been some great examples of that. And there's manufacturing companies that have changed their plant production systems to be able to produce, you know, PPE gear that were inherently producing other materials. There's even manufacturing plants now that are making plexiglass, that's
Right.
plexiplastic and glass products that are going into all the grocery stores. And you know, so I think there is some really unique examples of brands that are seeing what's going on still. You know, the word that I use a lot is relevant. You know, relevance, like that they're still choosing to find ways to remain relevant throughout this. I think there's other brands too that are just sitting on their hands and hoping that this is going to be a very quick you know, a quick sort of turnaround time for them, and they can get back to usual. And some of them might be right, that might happen, but I'm fearful that for other brands that's not going to be the case.
Yeah.
Um, so I think like this leads into a good sort of topic of conversation, but disruption. So you know, I think there's many verticals right now that have been exposed in one of two ways. They've been exposed in a positive way where, you know, they've been building XYZ product for 10 or 15 years and it's never really had a market purpose. Now it has a massive market purpose. And there's other verticals that I think have been kind of going through this experience of getting exposed at certain periods throughout the last decade, but now there's a massive limelight shining right on them, and they're having to figure out how to survive. And so the example that I have is, obviously I'd love to chat about with you, is retail. So conventional brick and mortar operations is one example I'd love to chat with you about and just get some perspective from you. Where do you see retail going? Do you think it's going to go back to business as usual? Do you think it's something that's going to be under massive disruption? What do you think?
I think, well, I believe every industry. I can't think of many, if any, that are not going to have to pivot to remain relevant, and those who are just, I struggle to see how they're going to remain relevant. So brick and mortar retail, I mean, is it going away? Too soon to say. But e-commerce, I mean, e-commerce is just exploding. Like, for all the reasons we know, it's exploding. People can't go to the store, so everything's being bought online. And what we are seeing, and we're going to continue to see, is like, oh, why would I bother going to the store if I can make a few clicks and it's here in 2 days or 3 days or a week? And so retail, I think, is going to is suffering and will continue to suffer. There's going to be some companies that just can't recover from the financial loss and will close. But I think, and it's not just, I mean, from a social distancing perspective, all retail, like restaurants, stadiums for sports teams, stadiums for concerts, those are all going to struggle because the social distancing, if we believe the experts, is not going away anytime soon. So retail, for example, I think one of the hardest hit is going to be department stores. Right, if you look like at a Macy's or a Nordstrom's, or it's one thing to be at the Gap or something, and 10 of you can go in at a time. Downtown New York City has a Macy's that's floors and floors and floors high. They're not going to let thousands of people in there anymore. So our department stores, the Sears and the Eatons of the world, which are sort of lower down the value chain, they've already come and gone. So are they next? I think that there's always going to be this subset of people who prefer brick and mortar. They like going to the mall. They like the tactile experience of shopping. Just to be specific about retail. So I do think it's going to continue to exist.
And I think, just to go on to your point there, like as you mentioned, like I think when you look at the channel, the buying process of those channels, having an omni-store process or a buying process where you're able to have a really good integration between offline and online, I think is really the way the future looks. If you look at the way a lot of these stores are maybe becoming more of an experience element, and maybe it's about, maybe what the traditional store experience of actually you taking the product off the rack and leaving with the product, maybe that doesn't really exist in the way that it did before. Maybe it's about the experience of being inside of there. And I think, Apple is another example of somebody that took the buying process from the consumer level of a typical electronic buying process and totally morphed it into education, workshopping. It's a very different experience to go into an Apple store. They don't have conventional cash register systems. It's all done on handheld devices where they bring your product to you and you leave the store and it prints out your receipt. I mean, even just some of that is definitely, it was ahead of the time, in my opinion. And I'm curious to see, like, Shopify is an example for e-commerce. Their balance sheets, or their earnings are going up and up and up, and they're signing up more and more brands, and not just small. They were always arming the rebels. That was their mantra. But now they're looking at big brands, and they're helping big brands create that sort of multi-channel buying process. I'm curious to see where that goes and how that evolves. The other one is air travel, that is something that I'm interested in as well. Is, if you think about it, air travel historically has been, airlines make money when you can get as many people inside of an aircraft as possible.
Yeah.
And without a vaccine, that model looks very different. So, I mean, I think that's interesting. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on that and air travel, and what do you see happening there?
I mean, I've been watching the whether it's Congress, it's escaping me now, but I've been watching the airline industry talk to them about wanting more, in the States anyways, about needing more money in terms of the bailouts because of the trouble they're in, and not getting it better anytime soon. I mean, to the point, a lot of consumers whose flights were canceled are getting credits versus their money back, which is a whole other thing, whether ethically that's okay. But to your point, they're not going to pack planes anymore. And not even just that. Like, let's just look at the industry for a minute. Business to business, road warriors, people who are traveling on business all the time, agencies who are out pitching. They're now realizing that business continuity and successful pitches and successful business deals can be done over, remotely, over a platform like the one we're using, or Zoom or whatnot. And so why would they spend as much in air travel as they've been spending? So I think from a social distancing perspective, the air travel industry is going to be hit. From a, hey, did we really need this? Did we really need to do, speaking to a former and still at times road warrior, the model has now proven itself that you don't actually have to be in the same room all the time to have business continuity, to build strong relationships, to close deals. So I think from that perspective, the airline industry is going to be hit very hard, and it's going to, and it's not going to be the only one, right? I think in positive ways, if you look at the IT infrastructure industry, I don't think anything has driven digital transformation companies like no CEO, no CIO, no CTO has driven digital transformation in the way that COVID has. You know what I mean? Like, the roadmap is like, yeah, okay, we didn't have the ability to do teleworking. You better get to that. We didn't have business continuity tech stacks, and we can't access our data remotely, and we don't have stuff in the cloud. And the stuff that I'm hearing and then we're reading in the news about businesses who are really struggling with business continuity because they weren't prepared for what's come, that's absolutely going to, IT industry is going to make a lot of money in the next little while. But there are other industries that are really in peril. So we've talked about sort of what's going to happen at retail. We talked about the airline industry. But the office real estate industry, like I was just saying, you're going to realize, okay, do I really need those thousands and thousands and thousands of square feet of Class A space, or Class B space, or Class C space, when we've all been doing a pretty good job working from our kitchens or whatnot? And I'm already seeing among my clients, among a friend of mine who's in the business, companies already looking at their rental agreements. What can they get out of? Can they bring the space down to half? So I think the office real estate industry is going to be in trouble, like movie theaters. So movie theaters are going to be hit in two ways. There's the social distancing. For the same reason they're not going to pack restaurants or stadiums or planes, they're not going to pack theaters anymore. But aside from that, you would think at some point they might recover from that as things start to ease up a bit. But their model has just been blown up, because the major movie houses used to give them, I think it's 3 months runway before it would, direct to screen versus direct to streaming. And now the movie houses are understandably having to bypass the theaters because they're closed. And we've already seen a couple of major, Hollywood A-lister major movies being released online, and they're bypassing the theater completely. The theater, that's where they made their money on those first 3 months of ticket sales before it was released to stream, and on concessions. Well, there's no more concessions, and now they're not getting that money in the first 3 months of the blackout period. So
yeah, and I think
Yeah,
and I think the other thing to tie into that is, if you go one step higher than that, look at the studio level. So movie studios inherently make their money on being able to do these release tours where, they have marquee events held, there's a ton of press, they're able to really drive awareness to release dates, and they can do early releases. There's really it's been this system that really had worked quite well. But that's how they make the majority of their money, is off, off box office, sales. That's really how they make their money. But now I think it's interesting because they're in a position where they're going to have to rethink how that looks, because what they're doing right now is they're just pushing release dates. They're saying, we're not going to release James Bond anymore in April like it was planned to be released. We're going to push it to November. We're not going to, and they're hoping that they can push them all far enough that they can be back to some normality. But there's places in the world that may not be back to that normality. And so I think it also raises this interesting question of, are brands able to look at pivoting in a way where all of a sudden they're going direct to release, and maybe it's getting released in a timed fashion on everyone's personal device, and there's a countdown, and they can still monetize it. Because you think about it, whether you pay $15 to go to a movie to watch it and have the experience of going to the movie theater, or watch it from your home, there's still, I think, an ability there to be able to create a monetary thread. So I'm interested to see what happens there and how they look at that. And it's obviously it's going to be interesting to see how the next sort of 12 months rolls out.
Yeah, I mean, and they were in trouble anyways. I mean, I don't know the last time you were in a theater, but they were already in trouble, right? With the Netflix and the Amazon Prime and all the streaming things. And I don't know if you noticed, like AMC, Landmark, all Odeon, Cineplex, they have all spent millions and millions and millions in upgrades, right? So now there's the reclining seat. Now you can buy dinner while you're watching a movie. You can get wine, because they're competing with, I can watch this on a huge screen with surround sound in my living room, in my fat pants, having a glass of wine, eating some snacks, and not have to spend $100 for the family there, right? And so they've already just spent millions and millions of dollars on improving their infrastructure to try and change that experience, and not that long ago, within the last couple of years. And now here they are, right? Now they might be blown up. So I agree with you. It's going to be very interesting to see not just that industry, but I honestly can't think of one industry that's not going to be touched by this, either in a very positive way or a very negative way.
So maybe let's talk about capital and funding and cash flows. I mean, lots of businesses that are looking at growth, they're looking at either scaling, and before the pandemic, pre-pandemic, maybe they have plans of an acquisition, or they're looking at growing or identifying a new market to move into. And now they're in this precarious position where raising capital has become really difficult. Cash flow is tight. They're kind of having to rethink a little bit. What are your general thoughts? Like, how do you see brands being able to deal with this? Do you think, this is going to just work its way out and there'll be capital available again? Or do you think it's going to cause brands to maybe think differently about how they, evolve, or how they want to grow?
I think both. I think that, I mean, from a capital, from a funding, from, cash flow, private equity and whatnot, like we were talking about earlier, there are going to be a number of companies who do pivot, who do find a way to stay relevant. You mentioned some of them, I mentioned some of them, who won't, in theory, have as much of a problem, if any, with cash flow if they don't end up very, cash positive, because they did pivot, and because they're making hand sanitizer instead of alcohol, or they're making PPE equipment instead of fast fashion that you can find, in any store. So I think those are the brands who, not only from a cash flow perspective, but from a brand equity perspective and brand awareness and brand sentiment perspective, are going to do okay. And then there's going to be the brands that are, or the companies that aren't, and the brands they represent aren't going to be okay. And what's going to happen there is any, hedge funds, private equity firms, venture capitalists, angel investors, they're going to get an opportunity to help or acquire or break apart and sell a number of companies, and that's very sad, right? There's so many bankruptcies coming down the pipe in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. Very, very sad for those involved. Also offers the opportunity to those with cash to take that company or acquire a piece of it, acquire all of it, and help it survive. And so, that's my thought sort of on the cash flow, on, how do they market themselves? How do they function? How do they ideate? I think we're going to see a lot of innovation coming out of this, and hopefully the cash to fund it, and fund the minds that might have the innovation. So whether it's, we're going to start seeing surfaces, for example, but countertops made of copper, or public handles made out of copper, because copper's been shown that the virus can't live on copper, that kind of thing. So brands are going to have to figure out, to look at their business model, look at their offering. How do they ideate? To use the word you use, relevancy. I love that word. It's one I use a lot myself. Like, can they, get out of that sort of tone deafness? And to a large degree, most companies are going to have to reinvent themselves and pivot the brands that they represent. I think that I'm an optimist, so I always think in the long term there's going to be a lot of good that comes out of this. But I'm also not so naive, to think that there's not going to be a lot of people's lives that are financial situations are negatively impacted quite significantly.
Yeah. So I guess as kind of a final touch point, it would be good to, for two things, I guess. So if, brands are looking at their positioning and maybe even just internally they're having issues right now thinking about, like, should we be marketing ourselves? How do we remain relevant through this? What advice would you give, generally speaking, to either those C-suite, those marketing managers, CMOs that are, in that consideration phase at the moment? What advice would you give them, Teresa?
I think that for me, again, a business brand strategist, it always comes back to look back at your roots and who you are and what you stood for. See if that's still relevant. If it's not, you need to tweak it, or you're just going to come across as tone deaf or insensitive or worse. If you are still leading, with your core values and leading with, the sense of community and sense of, not like consumerism and capitalism, but not at the expense of human or cultural capital, if you know what I mean. I think that leading with authenticity and transparency and is really important to, addressing what's really happening in the world, addressing from a customer experience, it's really how is this impacting your customers, your existing customers, your potential customers, and deal with that. It's really not about the business right now and what's going to help them. Although ultimately, if they do it right, if they do what's right for their customers and they give their customers what they need, or all of their audiences, actually, including their employees, then they have a better chance of surviving, of being relevant, and of coming out of this not only just relevant, but well regarded.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, oh, for sure. Yeah, and I think the other thing that I've seen and done a little bit of reading about as well through this, but you're seeing indicators, there's different leadership styles through this that you're seeing, and there's been some incredible brands, as you've mentioned, that some earlier in the conversation, that are really standing up and are doing their part. And some would say, well, no, that's not really altruistic behavior, or it wouldn't make it to the media. But in many cases, I believe it's authentic. A lot of these brands are really stepping up and they're doing what they can to contribute. And so, I mean, I think that there is an element of that I find, it's heartwarming, it's inspirational to see sort of how some of these brands are standing up through this. And I
Yeah.
think that also leaves other brands that might be in their space, they might be in closely related spaces, that also gives them something to look at. And it also becomes an opportunity for brands to be able to learn from that and learn and see how, that's sort of been able to impact their business.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It's sort of, what I mentioned earlier, a healthy dose of leadership and a healthy dose of servant leadership. That's
Yeah.
that's exactly that. I don't, and I've had debates with friends, family, peers, or whatnot around. Well, look at that company trying to make a buck. You look at that company profiting off what's happening right now, and my argument is like every company is in business to make money. I don't have a problem with a company making money. Where it becomes a little gross or a little icky, like is like, as I said, revenue is okay as long as it, and particularly in times of crisis, it's not at the cost of human or cultural capital. And are you leading with values that people are going to respect and admire, and while having business continuity, while making revenue, and frankly while making a profit. I don't have a problem with that. But to use your word, like altruistic, are you doing it for the right things? Are you doing it because yes, you're going to make money, but you're doing the right thing and you're doing it for the greater good? I mean, if the motivations are pure and they're authentic, then of course there's going to be the cynics going, "Oh, look at you, make it a buck." But that's what businesses are here for. Businesses are here to make profit. They pay their employees who feed families and whatnot. But it's,
Mhm.
are you doing it with integrity? Are you doing it with authenticity? Is your motivation altruistic, even if you're making $1 in the process. So to your point, I think we're already seeing that, right? There's a lot of criticism around how some organizations are driving their companies, driving their brands, a lot of praise for others. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon. And I guess, to sort of sum up that whole comment to your question, what advice would you give? This is not the time to stop marketing. If anything, you should sort of be doubling down on letting people know who you are, what you stand for, what you're bringing to not just the market and consumerism, but what are you bringing from a values-based perspective to the people you serve.
Yeah. No, that's great advice, Teresa. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show, and I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Cheers.
Okay. Cheers. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.